Can a heart forged in darkness survive the light of true love? In the gilded cage of the Volkov estate, Ilara polished silver that was worth more than her entire life. A life forfeit to Dante Volkov, the Shadow King of the city's underworld. Her father's debt was a chain, and this opulent villa was her prison. She moved through the marble halls like a ghost, invisible to the men in sharp suits who spoke in hushed, violent tones. Dante was a phantom she only glimpsed. A silhouette of power, the scent of expensive cologne and danger left in his wake. He was a man made of rumor and fear, his name a prayer on the lips of his allies and a curse from his enemies. Ilara knew only the cold reality of her servitude. Each day she tended to the blood-red roses in the garden, their thorns a familiar comfort against her skin, a reminder that even beautiful things in this world had to fight to survive. She never looked him in the eye, never dared to draw the attention of the monster whose cage she now cleaned. Her defiance was a tiny flickering flame within her, a silent promise to herself that this life would not extinguish her spirit, even if it owned her body. She was a captive, yes, but her soul she vowed would remain her own. A secret garden no Mafia dawn could ever touch. She existed in the periphery of his violent world, an unwilling spectator to a life of brutal opulence. That was until the day the shadows finally came for their king. The roar of gunfire shattered the afternoon calm, a brutal symphony that ripped through the manicured lawns of the estate. It was a brazen attack, a message written in blood and shattered glass. When the chaos subsided, Dante Volkov was carried back inside, not with the formidable stride of a king, but on a stretcher, his pinstripe suit stained a horrifying crimson. The Shadow King had been struck down. A coma, the doctor whispered, a long dark tunnel with no guaranteed exit. The villa, once ruled by an iron fist, now thrummed with a nervous predatory energy. His cousin Marco, the underboss with eyes like chips of ice, began circling the throne. His ambition was a poorly veiled secret, and with Dante silenced, it bloomed like a toxic flower. While men loyal to Dante like the stoic consigliere Luca watched with suspicion, Marco's influence grew. He saw Dante's fall not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. In the ensuing power vacuum, Ilara, the insignificant maid, was given a new terrifying task. The nurses were clinical, but Dante's men wanted one of their own always present. She was chosen for her quiet nature, her perceived meekness. Her new duty was to watch over the broken body of the man who owned her, to sit vigil in the silent antiseptic-scented room where the city's most feared man lay utterly helpless, trapped between life and death. The world she had tried so desperately to remain invisible in had just placed her at its very center. The master bedroom, once a place of intimidating power, was transformed into a sick room. The scent of gunpowder had been replaced by the sterile smell of medicine. Here Dante Volkov was no longer the Shadow King. He was just a man, tethered to life by the rhythmic beep of machines. Ilara's fear slowly gave way to a profound and unsettling pity. She cleaned his room, changed the cool cloths on his forehead, and in the suffocating silence she began to speak to him. Her voice was a soft whisper, a secret shared with the unconscious man. She told him about the wilting roses in the garden, about her childhood dreams of seeing the ocean, about the crushing weight of her father's debt. She confessed her fear, her anger, her desperate hope for a life she could call her own. "You hold so many lives in your hands," she murmured one night, tracing the sharp line of his jaw with her gaze. "But you are just as trapped as I am, aren't you?" In his stillness she saw not a monster, but a man scarred by a brutal world. The rumors spoke of a past betrayal that had hardened his heart, a lost love that had turned him to stone. Looking at his pale, unmoving face, she saw the cracks in the marble facade. Her emotional insight, her hidden gift, allowed her to see past the legend to the wounded man beneath. He was a prisoner of his own empire, and in that she found a strange, heartbreaking kinship. This room became her sanctuary and her confessional, a place where the maid and the dawn were just two lonely souls suspended in the quiet dark. One rain-lashed evening, the weight of her solitude and the strange intimacy of their shared silence became too much to bear. The machines beeped a steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat in the dim light. Marco had been particularly cruel that day, his words dripping with venomous insinuation, a reminder of her powerlessness. She looked at Dante's face, at the faint scar near his temple, At the lips that had ordered deaths and whispered commands, now pale and still. A wave of emotion she couldn't name, pity, tenderness, a desperate plea for connection, washed over her. He was the architect of her misery, yet in that moment, he was the only one who had truly listened to her secrets. Leaning down, her dark hair falling like a curtain around them, she pressed a soft, trembling kiss to his lips. It wasn't a kiss of passion but of compassion. It was a tear turned into a touch, a whisper of hope in a hopeless place. It was the most defiant act of her life. A moment of pure, unadulterated humanity offered to a man who dealt in death. For a split second she felt a flicker, a warmth that hadn't been there before. She pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs, her face flushed with the audacity of her actions. She had kissed the monster, the king, the shadow, and in the deafening silence that followed, she feared she had just sealed her own fate. Nothing happened for a week. The kiss remained her secret, a burning memory in the quiet room. Then, one afternoon, as she was changing the water for the single white rose she'd placed by his bedside, his eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his lips. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes, the color of stormy gray, slowly opened. They were unfocused at first, clouded with confusion, before they scanned the room and landed on her. There was no recognition, only a deep, primal searching. Luca and the doctors rushed in, a flurry of activity and hushed, urgent voices. Marco pushed his way to the forefront, a mask of feigned relief poorly concealing his seething disappointment. Dante was awake. The Shadow King was returning. But he was weak, disoriented, his mind a fog. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness, his memory fragmented. Yet through the haze one sensation remained, a ghost on his lips, a phantom touch of warmth and softness that made no sense. His gaze would constantly find Elara, a silent, questioning intensity in his eyes that made her skin prickle with fear and something else she dared not name. He was piecing together the world, and somehow she was at the center of his shattered puzzle. She was terrified he would remember, that he would punish her for her transgression. The king was back, and the maid who dared to touch him would surely pay the price. The day Dante finally spoke with clarity, the entire villa held its breath. Marco stood by the bedside, already issuing orders, positioning himself as the regent. "Don Volkov, you need your rest," he said, his voice slick with false concern. He gestured dismissively at Elara. "Get the girl out of here." He doesn't need a maid hovering over him. He reached for Elara's arm, his touch possessive and cold. Before his fingers could clamp down, a voice, raspy but forged in steel, cut through the room. "Non to Carla, don't touch her." All eyes snapped to Dante. He was pushing himself up on one elbow, his gray eyes blazing with a fire that had been absent for weeks. He looked past Marco, his gaze locking onto Elara, a look so intense it felt like a physical touch. He extended a hand, not in a request but a command. Trembling, Elara moved to his side. His fingers, surprisingly strong, wrapped around her wrist, pulling her close. With the entire room as his audience, his consigliera, his treacherous cousin, his most loyal men, Dante Volkov delivered his first decree since returning from the brink. "Leia mia," he declared, his voice gaining strength with every word. "She is mine." He looked directly at Marco, a silent, deadly promise in his eyes. "Touch her, and you die." The shock in the room was palpable. Marco's face paled, his mask of control cracking. Luca's eyebrows shot up in stunned surprise. Elara's heart felt like it would beat out of her chest. The Shadow King's next move wasn't about territory or revenge. It was about her. The insignificant maid was now the Don's most prized and most dangerous possession. Dante's recovery was swift, his strength returning with unnerving speed. But something within him had fundamentally changed. He kept Elara by his side constantly, a beautiful silent shadow to his own. She was no longer a maid but something more. She ate at his table, sat in his study as he conducted business, her presence a silent testament to his declaration. The dynamic was electric, a constant thrum of tension and unspoken words. To the outside world, his obsession was a weakness. "Love's worse than a hit," one of his captains grumbled. "It makes a man soft," but Dante was anything but soft. His rule became even more absolute, his punishments for disloyalty swifter. Yet with Elara he was different. He would watch her arrange roses, his gaze possessive and tender. "Your hands are too delicate for thorns, mia cara," he'd murmur, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. Her fiery retorts, once born of fear, now became bolder. "My hands are my own, Dante," she would reply, meeting his gaze. "As are the thorns." He didn't punish her defiance. He seemed to crave it. Meanwhile, Marco watched from the shadows, his hatred curdling into a venomous plot. He saw Elara not as a person, but as the chink in Dante's armor, the key to his downfall. Luca, ever the wise consigliere, warned his boss. "She makes you vulnerable, Dante. Marco will use it." Dante simply looked at Elara across the room and replied, "She makes me human, Luca. It is a risk I am willing to take." As Elara spent more time within the inner sanctum, her fear was sharpened by a keen sense of observation. She listened to the conversations, not just the words but the spaces between them. Marco spoke of the ambush with a rehearsed grief that felt hollow. He would recount details of the shootout, but they would shift subtly with each telling. One night, while Dante was reviewing shipping manifests, Marco was describing the attack to a visiting captain. "The bastards came from the East Alley," he said, shaking his head. "We never saw them." Elara, who was pouring wine, froze. She remembered the early reports from Luca, the one she'd overheard in the frantic hours after the attack. The loyal men who had survived had all sworn the ambush came from the west, from the rooftops. It was a small detail, a slip of the tongue, but her intuition screamed at her. Later that night, when they were alone, she found the courage to speak. "Dante," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Marco lies." Dante turned from the window, the moonlight carving his face into sharp angles. He listened, his expression unreadable, as she laid out the inconsistencies, the subtle shifts in the story, the cold ambition in his cousin's eyes that she saw when no one else was looking. She had no proof, only her insight, the gut feeling that had kept her alive in this house. She expected him to dismiss her, to be angry at the accusation against his own blood. Instead, he studied her face, seeing not a hysterical girl but a woman of startling perception. "Ti credo," he said softly. "I believe you." In that moment he chose her word, the word of a captive maid, over the bond of family. He chose his heart over the code of omerta. The trap was set with brutal simplicity. Dante began to feign a growing weakness, a distraction born of his obsession with Elara. He missed meetings, delegating them to Marco. He spent his days in the rose garden with her, a lovesick king neglecting his empire, all for the benefit of watching eyes. Luca played his part perfectly, arguing with Dante in public, lamenting his lost leader. "She has poisoned your mind," he yelled one evening in the grand hall, loud enough for Marco's men to overhear. The bait was irresistible. Marco, believing Dante was truly compromised, called a meeting of the family's most powerful captains. He chose the warehouse by the docks, a place of grit and steel, far from the villa's opulence. He stood before them, a portrait of false sincerity. "Dante is lost," Marco declared, his voice ringing with manufactured sorrow. "His obsession with this girl has made him a liability. The family is at risk. He is no longer fit to lead." He paced before the hardened men. "The ambush weakened his body, but she has rotted his soul. It is time for new leadership. For strong leadership. I had to ensure his time was over. The ambush was my design. A necessary evil to protect us all." A heavy silence fell over the warehouse. Then, from the deepest shadows at the back of the room, a figure stepped forward. It was Dante, flanked by Luca and his most loyal guards. His face was granite, his eyes burning with an arctic fury. "Grazie, cugino," Dante said, his voice lethally calm. "Thank you, cousin, for making this so easy." Marco's face drained of all color. He had not just confessed, he had gloated. The captains, men who lived and died by the code of loyalty, turned their backs on him. Justice in their world was swift and without mercy. Marco fell not to a rival family, but to the venom of his own ambition, exposed by the woman he had so fatally underestimated. The darkness in the Volkov Empire receded, cleansed by the purge of its deepest poison. In the quiet aftermath, the opulent villa felt different, lighter. Dante stood with Elara on the balcony overlooking the moonlit garden, the scent of roses rising to meet them. He turned to her, his stormy eyes now clear and filled with an emotion she had once only dreamed of. "You saved me," he said, his voice raw. "Not just from Marco, but from the man I was." He took her hand, his touch no longer that of a captor, but of a devoted equal. "I offered you protection," he continued, "but I want to offer you my world. Not as my possession, but as my queen." Elara looked into his eyes and saw not the Shadow King but Dante, a man who had found his salvation in a whispered confession and a compassionate kiss. Her defiance had not been extinguished, it had been the spark that reignited his heart. "Love is not a weakness, Dante," she whispered, her fingers lacing with his. "It is the only real power there is." He pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not a ghost of a memory, but a fierce, passionate promise of a new beginning. They were a captive and a king who had found freedom in each other. Their love story, a single blood-red rose blooming defiantly in a world of thorns and steel. "So, I have to ask you, do you believe a love born in the darkest of places can shine the brightest? Tell me your most epic love story in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes in the power of a single kiss.